Hab ich mir in Herz geholfen, du mei, du mei, du mei. Heb ich auf a von Sholem, du mei, du mei.
So, I'm going to reorient a bit because I'm actually assuming that there'd be a higher percentage of people that already heard me, but okay, we've got a lot of new people here, so I'll give a little bit more of the background, but also I want to get into some things that are new. In 2008, we in Israel celebrated our 60th anniversary. This is a time of great celebration for us as Israelis, a time to give thanks for the fact that after 2,000 years of oppression, because we didn't have our homeland, that we again had some control of our own destiny. At the same time as we give a time for great celebration for us as Israelis, we know that for others it was the Nakba, the great disaster. And since I got here a little bit late, I could cut down my usual 5-hour talk simply by saying that regarding Palestinians at least, which is only one part of what we do, our goal is to bring a little bit closer to fruition the promise that God makes time and time and time again in the book of Genesis, that through you shall all the families of the earth be blessed. What today is for us a blessing is for others a curse. We want to get to a win-win situation. What is a blessing for us is a blessing shared by all. On the occasion of that anniversary, we issued a series of 2 radio ads, each of them starting with a piece of the original recording of our first Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion, reading out our Declaration of Independence. And in the first you hear him say that the country will be mushtetet, that the very foundation of its existence will be chirut, tzedek, v'shalom, freedom, justice, and peace as envisioned by the prophets of Israel. And then in the second version of the ad, he reads from the next line, which says, the country will guarantee total social political equality for all, regardless of religion, nationality, or gender. And our ads went on to say, we had this vision 60 years ago, now 64 years ago. We had this dream. Not what other people were expecting us to do, what we were expecting of ourselves, what we were dreaming for ourselves, the country that we thought we were coming here to create. Where we succeeded, and where we not yet succeeded. We didn't say where we failed. 60 or even 64 years is not a long time as countries go. But where we not yet succeeded. And if we're being honest with ourselves, particularly in the area of human rights, we have to acknowledge that we haven't lived up to our own dream, what we thought we were coming to do, to build. But some of you may be asking, well, what did the prophets have to say about freedom, justice, and peace? Did they all agree with each other? We love to quote the prophet Isaiah about beating swords and plowshares. We kind of like to forget about the prophet Joel talking about beating plowshares and swords. Okay. One of the most amazing video clips that I have is from a number of years back when we caught 2 Israelis in the act of stealing olives from Palestinian-owned trees. And as they're trying to escape before the police arrive, this surreal, bizarre situation develops. We get into this seemingly esoteric debate about what the Jewish tradition has to say about the property rights of non-Jews in the land of Israel. It seems esoteric, but it's not so esoteric when you understand that certainly for Judaism and Islam being such powerful forces in this part of the world, and people live their lives according to these esoteric ideas, it's important. It wasn't the most productive discussion. Nobody was listening to each other all that carefully. And at a certain point, in a very mocking way, one of them says to me, well, you must be reading from a warped Torah scroll. And I must admit, I more or less descended to their level and said, I think you're right. I think I am reading from a different Torah scroll than you are. Mine has things that seem to be missing from yours, like don't steal, don't trespass. Okay? point being, though, on the one hand, if anyone ever says to you, Judaism says, a big red warning light should go off. Our tradition is just too ancient, multi-layered, and based on debate to say that about almost anything. But on the other hand, it means that we can't even get our act together to figure out what our own tradition says about the burning moral issues that we're dealing with as a society. And if our first mandate in rabbis of human rights is to prevent or redress human rights abuses, then our second mandate is to try to introduce into the intellectual universe of our fellow Israelis another way of understanding Judaism. Very different from the one that people are mostly being socialized into, which is a very problematic mixture of extreme nationalism and extreme particularism. One of our founders, his daughter went to B'nai Akiva, one of the Orthodox youth movements, and met her husband-to-be when there was a vaguely liberal speaker, and they were the only two people that clapped their hands at the end. That's when they met each other. Anybody who's looking, that's a piece of free advice. But it's anecdotal, but it's indicative of what's happening in that society. The way I grew up in Erie, Pennsylvania, it was simply assumed that a basic part of what it means to be a Jew is to be concerned about universal human rights and social justice. That's what I learned from my parents, from my rabbis, from my teachers. Opinion polls show that these are some of the most widely held beliefs among the North American Jewish community. And so when I first spent time in Israel, now I'll date myself a little bit, my first greatest shock was to find that the bagels were not readily available at the time. What kind of Jewish state is this? You can't get bagels. But the more profound shock was when I found out that these values, which were so axiomatic that I never would have thought of questioning them, were not shared by many Israelis, particularly religious Israelis. Israel is an extremely democratic country internally. The occupation, of course, there's no democracy. Inside Israel, we have racism, we have discrimination. Find me a democracy that doesn't. And in many ways, I actually think we're a more democratic society internally than the United States. I'll just give you two examples. We have a much wider range of opinions regularly expressed in the mainstream, let alone the alternative press, than you would find in this country. I'm going to be running back in a couple days to vote in the elections. We have 34 parties running. That's just a mess, okay? But there are big parties, small parties, Jewish, Arab, Zionist, non-Zionist, left-wing, right-wing, religious, secular. Small parties, some of them that have no chance whatsoever of making it over the threshold and into the Knesset. All of them getting state-funded. If I was in Israel right now, one of our cultural icons is what we call Tamulat HaBichirot. All right, it means for the 2 weeks before the elections, all these parties get state-funded television time and radio time to get their messages across. All right, now. So even these small parties that are never going to get into the Knesset, but now how much money was spent on the last presidential election in this country? All right, and what do we know about the connection between money and access and power? And so that's another one of the ways that I think that Israel is in some ways an incredibly democratic country. We're split right down the middle of many of the major issues facing us as a society. Many Israelis share many of our opinions, although all too many of them talk the talk without walking the walk. But as I said, most of those who support our opinions are not religious. Rabbis for Human Rights was founded during the first Intifada. There was more support among average Israelis for Palestinians during the first Intifada than later on in the second Intifada, let's say. There wasn't the same level of violence or terror. And many average Israelis who were particularly political or left-wing or activists simply felt that moral red lines have been crossed. And many of Israel's current human rights organizations, ourselves, B'Tselem, Positions for Human Rights, Workers' Hotline, were all created about this time. Our founder, Rabbi David Foreman, wrote an open letter He said, why is it that the religious establishment in this country seems only concerned with Sabbath observance and with kashrut, our Jewish dietary laws? Where are rabbis like Abraham Joshua Heschel? I just came from his daughter's house, Susanna Heschel. Where are the Abraham Joshua Heschels running around this country and crying Gewalt, speaking to some of the burning moral issues of our society? Rabbi Heschel was a senator of a long line of Hasidic rabbis, saved from the Holocaust, spent his career here teaching and writing amazing books. But he didn't just write books. He was one of the first people to speak out about the Jews of the former Soviet Union. He was one of the people behind the scenes that led to Nostra Aetate, the clauses in Vatican II that led to some rapprochement between the Jewish and Catholic communities worldwide. He was very active in the struggle against the Vietnam War, and his picture hangs on our wall marching with Martin Luther King. He's our role model of a rabbi and a scholar who is also a social activist. And this met a need that so many rabbis were feeling. To this day, we are the only rabbinic organization in Israel explicitly dedicated to human rights, and in which Reform, Orthodox, Conservative, Reconstructionist, and Renewal rabbis all coexist in one organization without strangling each other. And that was so unusual when we started that all we had to do was show up someplace where human rights abuse had taken place and all the press would show up. It's kind of like man bites dog. Today, it's not so easy anymore, but we have received the Speaker of the Knesset's Prize for our contributions to Israeli society. We've been endorsed by rabbinic organizations in North America and throughout the world. And we're at the human rights table, working every day with government ministers and members of Knesset and army commanders, the press, and the diplomatic corps, and what have you. We work sometimes with the courts, sometimes through media and public campaigns, sometimes direct field work and field action, putting our kippah next to the fence or whatever the may be, or whatever it was, working with the international community, and sometimes when all else fails through acts of civil disobedience. I myself have stood on trial for standing in front of bulldozers that have come to demolish Palestinian homes, not because of any security reason, but because of that catch-22 situation in which if you're a Palestinian, you have a clean security record, uncontested title to your land, you can stand on your head, and in most cases you won't get a legal building permit because of an intentional manipulation of zoning and building laws to make that impossible, or almost impossible. Now, I said a few minutes ago that Israel is a strong democracy, and I meant that. And in a democracy, you can't just go do civil disobedience every time you disagree with something, because that would be chaos. And because we do have democratic tools to change things within our society that we disagree with, as we often do. But as Rabbi Heschel would say so often, in a democratic society, some are guilty and all are responsible. Some are guilty, but all are responsible. So seeing that bulldozer tearing into that home, seeing the father of the household clutching as hard as he's about to have a heart attack, the women tearing at their hair and pleading with us to do something, and knowing the worst is yet to come. The moment I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. And that's the moment the children come home. They went off to school in the morning and there was a home, and then coming home from school and there's rubble. And seeing that Torah, which I'm sworn to uphold, being ground into the rubble along with that home, and that image of God we're all supposed to be honoring, being banished from that place. There comes a certain point when we had no choice but to stand in front of the bulldozers. Usually these things are closed after a year. In this case, I was put on trial. There were some amazing moments. First of all, as some of you may know, in some ways it's easier to do what we do in Israel than to be a Jewish leader and talk about these issues abroad. And there are many, many rabbis and other Jewish leaders in this country and elsewhere that even if they have concerns about what's going on in their hearts, They're concerned that people that don't have Israel's best interests at heart will twist their words in ways they didn't intend, and therefore they prefer not to say anything. And so it was very moving to us when we got over 400 rabbis to sign an open letter about the home demolition issue. And then it turned out that the moment I was going to take the stand on my own behalf fell between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, one of the holiest times in our Jewish calendar. As I said to the judge, from the moment that I knew that this was the day that I would take the stand, what kept on ringing through my heart, my head, are those words we say just before the Kol Nidrei prayer in Yom Kippur. We say, V'yeshiva Shamala, V'yeshiva Shamata. In the heavenly court above and the earthly court below, we can all pray together in this most holy of weeks. I said to the judge, Peter, it's going to be Yom Kippur. We believe every single human soul on this planet is being judged on that day. And therefore we ask God in the Yeshiva Shamala to move from sitting on the throne of strict justice and rather judge us while sitting on the throne of mercy and compassion. How can we ask that of God in the Yeshiva Shamala? If in the Yeshivot Shalmata, if in the earthly courts and institutions in which we are responsible both for justice and for mercy, if we don't do the same. I reminded the judge that in the Bible, in the original Hebrew, justice and law are synonyms. It's a tzedakah mishpat. Unfortunately, in our world, that's not always the case. So I had the prosecuting attorney in tears that day, but the judge remained rather aloof, and she was the one that counted. So we were convicted and then unconvicted when the prosecution said we were upstanding citizens and that it should be expunged for community service. Everyone thought I should do community service by rebuilding Palestinian homes, but the judge didn't go for that either. But having not received justice in a court of law, our first move was to go and rebuild, like a cornerstone, to start rebuilding one of those homes, which we did with help from rabbis from around the world. For a year, I could have taken you to visit that family in their home. You would have been able to see that they were living in the dignity of a home again. I would have shown you the housewarming gift we brought for the family, a grapevine and a fig tree. Of course, in the words of the prophet Micha, that every person should sit under their vine and under their fig tree, and none should make them afraid. That's what we want for every human being. That no Israeli should live in fear of terror. No Palestinians should live in fear of having their homes arbitrarily demolished. The home was demolished a year later. We did rebuild it again. And it's standing today. But we don't just do this endless cycle of build, demolish, in what is actually perhaps a Guinness Book of World Records for the longest high court case in the making. And some of you know, you've heard me talk about this for years. It's going to happen, it's going to happen, it's going to happen. But we have a pending high court appeal challenging the system of discriminatory system of planning which leads to these home demolitions. It's been postponed twice. It was supposed to take place last summer. Then it was supposed to take place in November. Now it's been postponed to like next October. The civil administration, the Army, says they're working really hard on it. They're trying to get their act together. We've actually, our original ask was to ask that the Army, which is responsible for planning, do a better job of it. And then we realized that that was kind of like rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. And we now have a much more difficult ask, although it was one that was actually mooted, at least in the Oslo Accords. But we're actually asking that in Area C, those parts of the occupied territories still under full Israeli control, that planning for Palestinian communities be returned to Palestinian hands. Yes. That's what we're asking. And by the way, again, it's a difficult ask. I always tell my staff, we don't just do something for pretend. We're doing this for real. We absolutely expect we're going out to win this one. But I have to admit that this is a tall order. Although the parallel thing that's happening is that many European countries in particular, having seen too many of the projects they funded getting demolition orders, such as the wonderful microenergy projects in the South Urban Hills, the solar panels and wind turbines, they've come to the conclusion, and the EU heads of mission have also issued a position paper saying basically the same thing. So there's also maybe going to be some political pressure in that direction as well. But all this brings me to something that I've been thinking a lot about, more and more and more in the last year or so. It's the challenge of power. Leonard Fine, in a book he wrote in the 80s called Where Are We?, tells a story about, he says, some guy, Moshe, he's a Russian Jew living, he says, in Minsk or Pinsk, it doesn't really matter. He says, and this guy had some Russian friends. And one day, he asks his friends, well, Moshe asks him, what do you really think about me, your Jewish friend? He said, well, Moshe, we like you. But there's just one thing. You Jews always think that you're better than everybody else. So he hums, Moshe hums and hems and haws a little bit. Says, well, there's just certain things, I don't know. I mean, for example, we Jews, we don't hunt. And they start laughing uproariously. They say, Moshe, you don't hunt because we don't allow you to own guns. In Israel, we own the guns. We decide what happens at the checkpoints. We have the majority in the Knesset. We decide how we're going to divide the economic pie. It's the acid test for everything that we'd like to think of as being Jewish values. And it's the test of power. Some of you may have heard that there was recently something called the Edmund Levy Commission. Some of you no doubt have heard of it. Well, the Israeli government's been in a dilemma recently because in a few very notable cases, the Israeli court system has told the government that they must evacuate or demolish settlement buildings because they are built on private Palestinian land. According to the Fourth Geneva Convention, all so-called state land should also be for the occupied people. But what's more difficult from the Israeli point of view is at least the Israeli government itself recognizes that some 21% of the lands that settlements are built on is private Palestinian land, and the actual number is much, much higher. So, not being able to just ignore the courts, especially when the government's legal advisor said if you don't do this, some of us are going to be hauled up before an international court. And coming on the other side from tremendous pressure from the settler movement and the extreme right, what do? You create a commission. So this commission, headed by a former Supreme Court Justice, Edmund Levy, was given basically the mission to make the treif kosher, to take these, find a way to saying it's actually legal to build settlements on private Palestinian land, and to start to authorize all the, since the Oslo Accords, that's the difference between a settlement and an outpost. A settlement was built generally before the Oslo Accords, and it has official Israeli approval. Because Israel committed not to building more settlements after the Oslo Accords, there's these outposts built generally without Israeli approval, government approval, although a government-sponsored study showed that sympathetic ministers were funneling money to them in any case. So, For gold-plated matzo ball, does anyone want to guess how many Palestinians were on this Edmund Levy committee? You got it. All right. Now, we're in Boston, aren't we? Or Boston area? Like, wasn't it Boston Tea Party? No taxation without representation?
Exactly.
The fact of the matter is that when we deal with planning, for example, there are no Palestinians in the Knesset where the laws are made. There are no Palestinian judges on the courts that decide their fate. There are no Palestinians in the army. At least no West Bank. I mean, there are some Israeli Palestinians, but or on the planning committees that make these zoning plans that are so discriminatory. To the Edmund Levy Commission, we wrote we submitted something to them, and there were two pieces of it. One reflecting our expertise as an on-the-ground organization. We just went through all the different villages we work with that are next to outposts or settlements, and we started talking about the human rights violations that even beyond even if you put aside the little tiny fact that many times they're built on the Palestinian land, even if we put that aside, all the other ways that the very existence of these settlements and outposts create human rights violations and make life miserable for Palestinians. And the other part was from Jewish sources. There is Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, was a late 19th century rabbi, credited as being one of the founders of modern Orthodoxy. And he writes, in the book of Leviticus, of course, and then in other places, we have the command of leket, that commands of leket and peah. We're supposed to leave the corners of our fields for the poor to glean. And if we're harvesting our grain and some sheaves fall, we have to leave them also so that the poor can come and glean them. And Rabbi Hirsch asks, why does the Torah have to get into this? Why not just let the landowners decide for themselves how to be good and just? And his answer is the following. He says, even with the best of intentions, when those with power and property allocate to themselves the white man's burden of deciding how to be just to those who have no representation and no power and no voice, he says, govel im pesha. It's bordering on criminality. And even with the best of intentions, it's going to end badly. Another Torah commentator, classical from the Middle Ages, Ibn Ezra, he says the following. He says, the commandment not to oppress the stranger, or the widow, or the orphan, those who are most weakest and most powerless in our society, is primarily directed against the dayan, towards the dayan, the judge. And the reason he gives us the following. He says, if a judge wrongs somebody from the dominant part of society, the people with power, they know how to appeal. They know how to shout. They know how to make their claims heard. When the judge, when those sitting in positions of power do wrong, do injustice towards the weakest and most powerless and most voiceless in our society, there's two different versions of the text. One says, Ein lahem oz, they have no power. And other versions of the text say, Ein lahem ozer, they have no one to stand by them. And that so perfectly encapsulates our reality in many ways. And you know that on principle, Rabbis for Human Rights is always working on at least one issue dealing with the human rights of Jewish Israelis, and at least one issue dealing with the human rights of non-Jews who are part of our society or under control. And so we work on issues of, we educate about Judaism and human rights. We work with the Army, with youth taking a gap year program, Mechinot Klam Svayot, between high school and the Army. We have courses in universities on Judaism and human rights. We have a program down in the Negev with Jewish and Bedouin women. We're finishing a third year now of a 3-year program to teach about the status of women in our different faith traditions, human rights, tools to be activists, and they do projects together. We believe we deal with the Bedouin in the so-called unrecognized villages in the Negev. Maybe I'll get back to talk about that a little bit later as well. African refugees. And the Israeli unemployed and those in need of a roof over their heads, the public housing. Believe me, I've seen in public housing projects, housing conditions at least as bad as anything I've seen in the occupied territories among Israelis. So whether we're talking about the Palestinian that isn't on the Edmund Levy Commission or on the planning commissions, or the person in the public, Israeli Jew in the public housing project who isn't sitting on the committees making public housing policy, as we go from a social welfare economy to a neoliberal economy which doesn't seem to see that there's any need to help those that don't have a roof over their heads. The issue is the same. Can we create a society in which those people who are so often voiceless, so often without oz or ozer, whether they can in some way be partners, at the table when the decisions are being made that determine their fate. One of the areas that we have some real potential crises right now are in the South Urban Hills. On the one hand, that's where our legal department does most of its work. And if you were to come and visit with me in the South Urban Hills, I would take you to a place called Bir La'ed, a Palestinian village, desolate for 10 years because settler intimidation had forced them all to leave until our legal team got them home. Now you saw children playing there again. And next door, the Tuamin Valley. For over 10 years, the settlers were using it for their flocks as the rightful owners were kept out. And today, the Palestinian owners are back in that valley with their flocks, sowing and harvesting grain. And our next step will hopefully get them back to be able to live in that valley again. And that's perhaps one of the reasons that a wonderful new right-wing organization in Israel called Regavim was called in. We know that the settlers were having emergency meetings because they were losing land case after case. Regavim is an organization which claims reverse discrimination against settlers in order to tell the army that they have to do more to demolish Palestinian homes. And it's been so frustrating because I sit into the court sometimes and Reconstructionism almost loses almost every case, but they win when they lose, because the counter argument is, by the army, we're okay, because we're demolishing, but just at our own pace. And you want to say, well, wait a second, guys, where is the voice saying, why are you demolishing at all? And we haven't been able to do that when we weren't a party, but now that they've gone after some of our clients, the village of Susia, we hope that Reconstructionism is going to rue the day that they went after somebody that we're representing. Susia, the villagers of Susia lived just inside on the Israeli side of the border before 48. They had lands on both sides. They were forced to move out of Israel proper into the West Bank. In 86, now under occupation, the village on their lands that they'd gone to live in was declared an archaeological site because an ancient Jewish synagogue was found there. I mean, we can't deny that Jews have also ancient roots in this land. And they went out, they were forced to go and live in caves in their farmland. But the problem was that on the farmland, again, because of this discriminatory system of zoning and planning, there was no way they were ever going to get permits to build homes. And now I get back to the issue of the Oz and the Ozel, power and who's standing by whose side. I was down there a few months ago with a diplomatic mission, and the spokesperson for the village said something that just blew me away. He said, in 1986, when they came to demolish our homes and expel us, there was nothing we could do, because we were all alone. So the difference today is we're not alone anymore. And that's not enough. It's not enough to just fight the good fight. We have to win that fight. And it's not enough because one of the greatest challenges perhaps for us as Israelis, even when we're trying to be helpful, is to make sure that we don't come in like the white knights in shining armor to save the poor natives. But I think that what we try to do, and I think generally do a fairly good job of, is working as partners, not just as the dominant force coming in to, again, bestow our beneficence on those in need of our help. Thanks. I want to mention 2 or 3 other projects. First of all, in terms of economic justice, right now, as I said, one of the areas that a lot of my time goes to is public housing. Any of you who followed the tent protest movements in Israel a year and a half ago, unfortunately, even as we come up on elections, a year and a half ago, hundreds of thousands of Israelis were in the streets. Some 91% of Israelis were supporting this social justice movement. And then it was all committed to death, and almost nothing has come out of it. Just the day I left for this trip, we held an event in Tel Aviv at one of the remaining tent encampments to remind people that the issue hasn't gone away as elections come up. We've written legislation to try to fix what is wrong in terms of public housing. A few years ago, we won in what many consider one of the most significant social justice victories in Israel, where we defeated the so-called Israeli Wisconsin Plan. if any of you have heard of the Wisconsin plant here in this country. A lovely idea. Try to get people on welfare back into the workforce. Can't argue with that. But it's done through something called the Shon Hara. The whole concept of the program, whether it was the program that took place in Wisconsin or in Israel or many of the others around the world, is Lashon Hara means to think poorly or evilly of people, speak evilly of them. And so when these programs start with the idea that the problem isn't unemployment, but it's the unemployed. And so, because they're all welfare queens driving Cadillacs and parasites, you have this carrot and stick approach. The stick being that if you're not cooperative, you get all your benefits cut. And that almost always increases poverty rather than lifts people out of poverty. A few years ago, this woman walks into our office to say thank you. Healthy, healthy-looking woman, looked like she should be out working. But she had a very difficult to diagnose psychological issue. She could not hold down a job. Everybody was fooled. The psychologist was fooled at first. Legal aid wouldn't take the case. There was no point. It was useless. It was hopeless. Her own family wanted to throw her out of the house. They said, "You're not pulling your weight." We were the only people that believed in this woman. It took us 2 years, an unheard of 4 appeals committees, and we eventually won. We got her benefits back, and maybe a little bit of her dignity as well, and she came in to say thank you. Now, we've got a donation jar back there. We survive and do everything we do because of donations of people like yourselves. Was it a good use of your money to spend 2 years and all these resources on a case that everybody thought there was no chance of winning? No, it wasn't. But social justice is not always achieved through logical cost-benefit analysis. As we taught in the Talmud, one who saves a single life, it is if one has saved an entire world. And every human being is an entire world. A few years ago, also, we were coming up on an impossible vote. Look, we were goners. The for-profit organizations, the corporations making money off this were pulling out all the stops. And I said to our staff, well, we had an empowerment group. We have an empowerment group of women that were in the program. Again, we defeated the program. It doesn't exist anymore, but at the time, and I said, we have to bring them into lobby. My staff said, nah, not a good idea. The Knesset can be a dangerous place. Sometimes I think it's more dangerous to walk around in the Knesset than out in the middle of the occupied territories, believe me. And I said, we don't have a choice. If we lose this vote, it's all over. So I said to these women, nobody will think poorly of you if you're not ready for this. But maybe, as Esther is told by Mordecai in the Bible, just for this reason, you're here. I said, when you go into that Knesset with these members of Knesset that don't want to give you the time of the day, that think you're dirt, that have every stereotype about you in the book, you're going to have one thing and one thing only in your favor, and that's the truth in your hearts. And you've got to find a way to make that truth in your hearts communicate to these people, these members of Knesset. And they did it. We won the vote. But the most amazing thing was the member of Knesset that argued most passionately and vehemently against the program in committee was Orly Levy. She's a member of Israel, of Beitenu, Avigdor Lieberman's, what I would say is a racist party. And to argue against the program, she told word for word, he told the personal story of an Israeli Arab woman, an Israeli Palestinian, from our empowerment group, that you'd met just an hour before. Now, if anybody had told me that somebody from Yisrael Beitenu could with such empathy tell the personal story of an Israeli Arab woman, I would have said, what have you been smoking? I want some too. I mean, it just can't happen. It's just impossible. I learned two things. First of all, that you never write anybody off, and you never underestimate the power of the truth in our hearts to speak to others. In terms of never writing anybody off, I'm going to tell you something which I don't think even many of the people here that have heard me 5 or 10 times, I think I don't know if any of you have ever heard this. Maybe a few. But believe it or not, one of my deep secrets from the past is when I was in high school, I actually played football. And to say I played football is an exaggeration. I was probably in the game in 4 years for maybe 4 plays, if that. Now, our coach was a Schreier. He would scream and cry and shout and exhort and foam at the mouth. But he said, I only shout at the people that I can make into better football players. In 3 years of varsity football, he never shouted at me once. Okay? There was no point. There was we had this record winning streak. He was a great coach, but there was nothing this man could possibly have done to have made me into a good football player. And the reason I say this is because some people say that when we try and shout and protest and try to change things, that we're being traitors, that we're anti-Israel. But the fact is, these are the greatest acts of faith possible. Because just like Coach Bestwick, if we did not believe at the end of the day in the basic goodness of our fellow Israelis, and if we did not believe in the very basic Jewish belief that people can change and improve and return to their true and highest selves, then we'd be wasting our breath. There'd be no point in doing what we do. I mean, in any case, to do the work we do, you have to have a predilection for beating your head against the wall. But you at least have to have the belief that maybe that someday that wall's going to break through. Okay? And I do not think that I could do the work that I do if I did not believe in the basic goodness of my fellow Israelis. I'll give you another example. First of all, opinion polls of Israelis show, and we've done focus groups, that the vast majority don't want anything bad for Palestinians. They're first concerned about their security and their economic well-being, but it's not that they're looking to oppress Palestinians. And most Israelis really, truly believe that we have the most moral army in the world. Now, one of the most difficult days of my life was the day that I couldn't say that anymore. I'd also like to be able to say that. I don't think we have the most immoral army in the world by any means. I certainly can't say that we have the most moral army. But think about it. What that means is the aspiration of Israelis is to have the most moral army in the world. And that's our little opening for hope. That's what makes our mission to hold up a mirror to burst some of those bubbles that have to be burst, so that maybe we can get a little bit closer to what we ourselves aspire to. The last thing I want to say is I should just briefly mention, of course, our Olive Tree campaign, where the good news is that if in 2002 Palestinians and those of us trying to protect them were being shot at, beaten, threatened, attacked, you name it, and the security forces weren't doing anything, as a result of our sending out volunteers as human shields, some of them getting their heads cracked open, engaging the security forces, and eventually going to Israel's High Court, we got a victory, which means that today, many Palestinians with the army protecting them are getting to lands they couldn't get to for 2, 5, 10, even 15 years. But sometimes, you know, I meet a soldier, he's angry, he's resentful. Just a couple weeks ago, we helped a guy by the name of Fauzi Ibrahim get to lands that settlers had been preventing him from accessing more and more and more of his land year after year after year. And again, on the basis of our higher court case and with the work of our legal team, we had him back working his land for the first time in I don't know how many years. I saw him working there maybe 2005. And I was talking with these two border guards, and you're helping the enemy. You're a traitor. How dare you have a kippah on your head? Now, who knows who among these people has lost a loved one or an army buddy? I was saying, I have to go protect their human rights? Why is my commander saying my job today is to protect Palestinians? That's an emotionally impossible thing to ask of anybody, and you can think of the parallels from the Palestinian side. But that's what you have to do. There's a midrash, a form of Jewish commentary. You remember something, the biblical story in Genesis, again, that Hagar and Ishmael are banished into the desert. They're dying of thirst. According to the Torah, God prepares a well and saves them. But according to the midrash, written by the rabbis almost 2,000 years ago, before God prepares this well, the angels come to God and say, "What are you doing? Don't you know all the problems the children of Ishmael are going to cause the children of Israel throughout history? Let them die. Just end it all right here." God says no. God knows that no future is inevitable. And God says, "Basher Husham," right now in front of me is an innocent child. And we too are created b'tselem Elokim, in God's image, and therefore have to be as godlike as is humanly possible. We too have to distinguish between that terrorist coming to murder my children, and bombs have gone off not far from my home, and that family that simply wants to put a roof over their heads or harvest their olives. And lastly, it comes down to hope. Since 2000, since the outbreak of the Second Intifada, Israelis and Palestinians have kind of been in one big, huge depression, collectively. There's no lack of peace plans out there, but what we really need is a binational psychologist. Poll after poll shows the same majority of Israelis and Palestinians that want a compromise, negotiated agreement, but even a larger percentage on both sides that say, we want peace, the other side doesn't. Again, it looks depressing, but remember, a week before Sadat came to Jerusalem, opinion polls in Israel showed a clear majority that were opposed to the very same things that they overwhelmingly endorsed once the act of an Egyptian president coming to Jerusalem and addressing the Israeli people from the Knesset said it was real, it could really happen. Once they realized it could happen, they knew they wanted it, as opposed to the psychological defense mechanism saying, well, I didn't really want it in any case. I don't know how many times when I have gone to rebuild a demolished Palestinian home, that Palestinian parents insist that their kids come and meet with us, and like deja vu, the same conversation. Our 10-year-old son has just seen his home demolished in front of his eyes. He's just seen his parents humiliated in front of his eyes. What do we say to our 10-year-old child when he says, I want to grow up and be a terrorist? We want our son to know that not every Israeli comes with guns to demolish our homes. That there are Israelis who come to stand shoulder to shoulder with us to rebuild our homes. Why is it that we correctly get upset when we hear about propaganda being taught in Palestinian schools about Israelis? It's because we know that even if we were to sign the perfect peace treaty tomorrow, if we continue to teach hate about each other, that treaty isn't going to last. And if breaking down stereotypes, therefore, are essential for giving people the hope that something could be different, and if that, at the end of the day, is essential for our survival because there is no military solution and we're going to live together or we're going to die together, and I'd rather live together, then who is really doing more for Israel's long-term security interests? The people that demolish homes and steal olives and cut down trees and take over land, or those of us who rebuild the homes and replant the trees and pick the olives and help return land to their rightful owners? Yes, I believe that what we're doing is the just and right and Jewish thing to do, but frankly, it's the self-interested thing to do. It's the single best thing I can do to protect my children. And the real Zionism today, therefore, is working for an Israel which is not only physically strong, but is morally strong and lives up to our highest Jewish values.
Without justice, without peace, oh my, oh my, oh my, just a dream become a beast, oh my, oh my, oh my, where will exile draw the line, oh my, oh my, oh my, in Israel or Palestine, oh my, oh my, oh, nicht kein Tzedek, nicht kein Sholem, oh my, oh my, oh my, or a Cholem, geworna Golem, oh my, oh my.